Good day, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a nice cup of tea, and allow me to whisk you away to the sleepy English village of St. Mary Mead, sometime in the gentle 1950s. Here, among the roses and the gossip, nothing is ever quite as peaceful as it seems, especially when Miss Jane Marple is about. You are cordially invited to the Market Square Murder Chapter 1, a most unpleasant discovery. The village of St. Mary Mead nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, a place where time seemed to move at the leisurely pace of a summer afternoon. It was the kind of village that appeared in postcards and nostalgic reminiscences, with its thatched cottages, winding lanes bordered by hedgerows bursting with wildflowers, and a central green that had witnessed everything from medieval fairs to the occasional modern intrusion of a motor car. In the 1950s, the war was a fading memory, though its echoes lingered in the ration books tucked away in drawers and the subtle scars on the faces of those who had served. Life here revolved around the church spire that pierced the sky like a benevolent sentinel, the local pub where ale flowed as freely as gossip, and the weekly market that transformed the sleepy square into a bustling hub of commerce and chatter. On this particular third Thursday in June, the sun hung high in a sky of unblemished blue, casting a warm glow over the market square. The air was alive with the scents of fresh-baked bread, ripe strawberries, and the faint, earthy aroma of vegetables pulled straight from the soil. Vendors called out their wares in cheerful cadences, their voices mingling with the clip-clop of horses' hooves on the cobblestones and the distant chime of the church clock striking 11. Trestle tables groaned under the weight of homemade jams in glistening jars, eggs nestled in straw baskets, and bolts of fabric in every hue imaginable. Children darted between the stalls, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the haggling of housewives and the gruff negotiations of farmers. Miss Jane Marple, a diminutive figure with a crown of fluffy white hair and eyes as sharp as polished sapphires, navigated the crowd with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the world without ever seeming to intrude upon it. She was dressed in her customary dove-gray knitted suit, a garment that spoke of practicality and understated elegance, complemented by a string of pearls that had been a gift from a long-departed nephew. In her hand she carried a capacious black handbag, and over her arm hung a wicker basket already half filled with the morning's purchases, a small pot of honey from old Mr. Beecher's stall, and a bunch of lavender that perfumed the air around her. Miss Marple had come to the market with a specific purpose: to acquire 2 ounces of lavender wool from Mrs. Harmon's haberdashery stall. Knitting was one of her great pleasures, a rhythmic activity that allowed her mind to wander freely while her fingers created something useful. As she approached the stall, Mrs. Harmon greeted her with a warm smile, her round face flushed from the heat and the bustle. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Lovely day for the market, isn't it? I've got that wool you asked about last week. Finest quality, straight from the mill in Yorkshire." Mrs. Harmon was a stout woman in her 50s with a penchant for floral aprons and an encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs. She rummaged beneath the counter and produced a skein of soft, purple-hued yarn, holding it up for inspection. Miss Marple examined it closely, her pale blue eyes appraising the texture and color. "Yes, that will do splendidly, thank you. 2 ounces, if you please." As Mrs. Harmon weighed and wrapped the wool, the 2 women exchanged pleasantries about the weather, the upcoming garden fete, and the health of various mutual acquaintances. It was during this conversation that Miss Marple's keen ears picked up a snippet of gossip from the adjacent stall, where 2 elderly ladies were discussing the recent arrival of a new family in the village. But before she could pursue the thread, a sudden, piercing scream shattered the convivial atmosphere. The sound came from the direction of the old stone war memorial that stood sentinel in the center of the square, a solemn edifice engraved with the names of local lads who had fallen in 2 world wars. The crowd, which had been a fluid mass of movement and murmur, froze for an instant, then surged toward the source of the disturbance like a tide drawn by an invisible moon. Gasps and exclamations rippled Chapter 2. Tea and suspects. By 4 o'clock, the afternoon sun lay warm across the lawns of Gossington Hall, turning the old brick a mellow rose and gilding the leaves of the copper beech that had stood sentinel for 2 centuries. Inside the drawing room, the French windows stood open to the garden, letting in the drowsy hum of bees and the faint scent of Philadelphus. Dolly Bantry, large, untidy, and comfortably dressed in lilac linen, was in full cry, her voice carrying through the house like a trumpet voluntary. "Jane, my dear, do sit down before you wear a hole in my carpet. Tea is coming directly, and I have scandal enough to keep us going until supper." She patted the chintz sofa beside her. "Murder in the market square, I still can't believe it. Lucius Blakeney, of all people. Stabbed like a sweet pudding in front of the entire village. The Women's Institute will never recover." Miss Marple allowed herself to be guided to the sofa, arranging her skirts with neat precision and placing her handbag within easy reach. She had walked the mile from the village along shaded lanes, her mind turning over the morning's events with the calm persistence of a cat watching a mouse hole. "It was certainly very sudden," she murmured, accepting a cup of Earl Grey from the maid. "Though I fear Colonel Blakeney made himself unpopular with a great many people." "Unpopular?" Mrs. Bantry gave a snort that threatened the seams of her bodice. "He was a positive tyrant, always writing letters to the rural district council about noisy children, complaining that the church bells disturbed his afternoon nap. And as for poor Evelyn, well, the things one heard. He treated that girl like a subaltern on parade. No wonder she looked thin." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. The cup was delicate Sèvres, a wedding present from Dolly's late husband, and the bergamot was perfectly balanced. "People who bully others often live in fear themselves," she observed. "Tell me, Dolly, who benefits now that the Colonel is gone?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the delight of legitimate gossip. "Money, you mean?" "Well, Evelyn inherits the house and whatever is left after the Colonel's extravagances. There's Blakeney House, of course, and the investments. Though I hear he lost rather a lot on some South American railway scheme. Then there is young Timothy Green, the nephew. Lucius was always threatening to cut him out of the will because of his painting nonsense. Timothy will get the residue now, I imagine, unless the Colonel changed his will at the last moment, which he was perfectly capable of doing in a temper." "And Captain Hale?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that could still have been heard in the kitchen. "Ah, now there's a pretty kettle of fish. Roger Hale has been squiring Evelyn about for months. Tennis parties, drives to the coast, little dinners when the Colonel was supposed to be at his club. Tongues have been wagging like dogs' tails. And he was standing right behind her when Lucius fell. Very convenient." Miss Marple's pale eyes rested on the garden, where a blackbird was tugging determinedly at a worm. Convenient or protective, one wonders. At that moment the door opened and Colonel Bantry's old spaniel waddled in, followed by Jane, Mrs. Bantry's housemaid, bearing a plate of scones still warm from the oven. The conversation paused while butter and strawberry jam were generously applied. When the maid had gone, Mrs. Bantry continued, "And then there is Felicity Blacklock at the post office. Lucius accused her publicly of steaming open his letters. Marched in last week and shook his stick at her across the counter. Poor Felicity went white as paper. She's a proud little thing, and everyone knows she supplements her salary by, well, let us say she is not always as discreet as she might be with interesting correspondence." Miss Marple spread jam with care. "Curious letters?" "From London, mostly. Solicitors, I believe, and one or two on pale green notepaper that smelled of French perfume. Felicity denied everything, of course, but the colonel threatened to report her to the postmaster general. A silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the grandmother clock in the hall and the distant sound of a lawn mower. Miss Marple finished her scone and brushed a crumb from her lap. "And the weapon? Has anything been found?" "Not a trace," Mrs. Bantry said triumphantly. "Inspector Craddock's men searched every stall, every handbag, every perambulator. They even emptied Mrs. Butt's cabbage barrow. Whatever it was, an ice pick, Dr. Haydock thinks, or something equally nasty, vanished as completely as though it had never existed." Miss Marple smiled, a small cat-like smile that Dolly Bantry knew from long experience meant her friend was several moves ahead in whatever mental chess game she was playing. "Nothing ever truly vanishes," she said softly. "It is merely waiting to be found by the right person." Mrs. Bantry refilled their cups. "You'll look into it, won't you, Jane? Craddock is a dear boy, but he hasn't your eye for the human heart. And St. Mary Mead simply cannot have a murderer at large. Think of the effect on the garden fete." Miss Marple picked up her knitting, lavender wool, the beginnings of a bed jacket, and her needles began their quiet, methodical click. "I shall observe," she said, which both women knew was as good as a promise. Outside, the sun slipped lower, painting long shadows across the velvet lawn. In the distance, the church clock struck 5, and somewhere a blackbird sang as though the world were still safe and orderly. But in the drawing room of Gossington Hall, 2 elderly ladies sipped tea, and between the scones and the gossip began to unravel the first threads of a tapestry woven from greed, fear, and the small, deadly passions that can flourish even beneath the roses of an English village. Chapter 3. The matter of the peppermint bag. The morning after the shocking events in the market square dawned crisp and clear, with a light mist lingering over the meadows that surrounded St. Mary Mead like a soft, protective veil. The village was abuzz with speculation, the kind that spread faster than wildfire in dry grass, leaping from cottage to cottage over garden fences and through open windows. Miss Jane Marple, ever the early riser, had already enjoyed her modest breakfast of tea, toast, and marmalade in the sunny nook of her kitchen, where the aroma of freshly brewed Darjeeling mingled with the scent of roses climbing the trellis outside. She had donned her sensible walking shoes and a light shawl against the morning chill, intending to pay a condolence call on Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard at Blakeney House. Such visits were expected in times of tragedy, and Miss Marple found them invaluable for gathering those little threads of information that others might overlook as mere gossip. Blakeney House stood at the edge of the village, a handsome Georgian structure with ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows that caught the sunlight like diamonds. It was set back from the lane by a sweep of gravel drive, bordered by well-tended flower beds where lupins and delphiniums nodded in the breeze. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the drawn curtains in the upper windows, a sign of mourning that seemed almost theatrical in its solemnity. The front door was answered by a young maid, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or perhaps from the strain of the previous day's events. "Mrs. Pritchard is in the morning room, miss," the girl said with a curtsy, leading the way through a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes following visitors with judgmental stares. Evelyn Pritchard received her guest with a composure that spoke of breeding and perhaps a touch of inner steel. She was a woman in her mid-30s, strikingly beautiful, with raven hair swept into an elegant chignon, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dressed in a simple black frock that accentuated her pale complexion, she rose from a chintz-covered armchair by the window, where she had been gazing out at the garden. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice steady but laced with a faint tremor. She gestured to a tray on the side table where a silver teapot steamed gently beside delicate china cups. "Won't you join me for tea? It's Assam. Lucius always preferred it strong." Miss Marple accepted with a nod, settling into the opposite chair and allowing her hostess to pour. The room was a pleasant space, filled with the soft light filtering through lace curtains and adorned with vases of fresh flowers that lent a fragrance of lilies and freesias. On the mantelpiece stood a collection of silver-framed photographs. The colonel in his uniform, stiff and proud, a younger Evelyn on her wedding day, smiling radiantly, and a few snapshots of family gatherings that seemed oddly formal. As they sipped their tea, Miss Marple offered her sympathies in her gentle, unassuming way. "Such a dreadful shock for you, my dear, in broad daylight, too. It's quite unthinkable." Evelyn set down her cup with a slight clink, her hands betraying a momentary shake. "I simply cannot understand it, Miss Marple. Lucius went to the market for his usual bullseyes. Mrs. Simpkins at the sweet stall keeps them specially for him. And then this horror. He was so particular about everything, you know. Even the way his sweets were packaged." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window again as if replaying the scene in her mind. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kindly interest. "Your husband was particular about his sweets, I believe. I've heard he had a fondness for those peppermint drops." She accepted a cucumber sandwich from the plate Evelyn offered, noting the fine tremor in the younger woman's fingers as she passed it. "Oh, dreadfully so," Evelyn replied, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. "He insisted the bag be twisted just so, with the red stripe on the outside. Said it kept them fresher, though I suspect it was just one of his little idiosyncrasies. He was like that, set in his ways from his morning routine to the polish on his shoes." She sighed, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I keep expecting him to walk through that door, barking orders as usual." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the silver cake stand, where a few uneaten biscuits lay forgotten. "And yesterday, was the bag twisted correctly when the tragedy occurred?" It was a seemingly innocuous question, but Miss Marple watched her hostess closely, her knitting bag resting at her feet like a faithful companion. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. I really didn't notice. Everything happened so quickly, the scream, the crowd surging forward. By the time I reached him, he was already gone." Her voice broke slightly and she turned her face away, composing herself with visible effort. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hall, and Captain Roger Hale entered the room, his presence filling the space with a masculine energy that seemed at odds with the feminine decor. He was a tall, tanned man in his 40s, with the weathered features of someone who had spent years at sea, and a mustache that curled jauntily at the ends. Dressed in a casual tweed jacket and slacks, he carried the faint scent of tobacco and cologne. "Evie, darling, I thought I heard voices," he said, his drawl smooth and reassuring. He nodded to Miss Marple. "Good morning, ma'am. Tragic business, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Captain Hale," Miss Marple replied mildly, her eyes taking in the way he positioned himself protectively behind Evelyn's chair, one hand resting lightly on the backrest. Though the old boy did rather ask for it, barking orders at everyone like he was still on the parade ground. Still, broad daylight takes a cool nerve. Miss Marple regarded him with her usual serene expression, but her mind was whirring like the gears of a well-oiled clock. "Or a desperate one, Captain Hale. Desperation can make even the most timid soul bold." She took another sip of tea, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Hale lit a cigarette with a silver lighter, exhaling a plume of smoke toward the ceiling. "Well, whoever did it must have vanished like a ghost," No weapon found, from what I hear. The inspector's men turned the square upside down. He chuckled dryly, but there was no humor in his eyes. Evelyn stirred, glancing up at him. Roger was kind enough to stay with me last night, Miss Marple. I don't know what I would have done without him. There was a warmth in her tone that spoke volumes, and Miss Marple filed it away for later consideration. As the visit drew to a close, Miss Marple rose to leave, thanking Evelyn for the tea and offering a few words of comfort. Time heals many wounds, my dear, though some scars remain. If there's anything I can do... She trailed off, her offer hanging in the air like a promise. Walking back through the village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the peppermint bag, that small, crumpled detail that nagged at her like a loose stitch in a sweater. Why had the colonel clutched it so tightly in death? And who might have known about his peculiar habit with the twisting? She passed the market square, now quiet and empty save for a few pigeons pecking at scattered crumbs, and paused by the war memorial. The spot where the body had lain was unmarked, but the memory lingered. Such a public place, she murmured to herself, and yet so private in its way. By the time she reached her own cottage, the sun was higher, burning off the mist and promising a warm day. Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair by the window, picking up her knitting and letting her fingers work automatically while her mind pieced together the fragments. The peppermint bag. It was more than a sweet wrapper. It was a clue, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to untwist its secrets. Chapter 4. The post office queue. The following morning broke gray and fretful, with a sharp little wind that sent the last of the cherry blossoms skittering along the high street like pale confetti after a wedding that had ended badly. By 9 o'clock, a queue already stretched from the door of the post office clear past the war memorial. For in St. Mary Mead, the post office served not only for stamps and postal orders, but as the unofficial exchange where news, true or embellished, was weighed more carefully than any parcel. Miss Marple joined the line just behind Mrs. Price Ridley, who was clutching a basket of eggs intended for the Red Cross and vibrating with indignation. "It's disgraceful," she announced to the world in general. "One cannot even buy a postage stamp without being reminded of yesterday's outrage. Poor Colonel Blakeney, murdered in broad daylight, and that hussy Evelyn Pritchard no doubt laughing behind her widow's weeds." Miss Marple murmured something soothing about the importance of Christian charity and allowed her gaze to travel along the queue. Directly ahead stood young Timothy Green, shifting from foot to foot, his fair hair untidy and a streak of cerulean paint on the cuff of his jacket. He kept pushing his spectacles up his nose in the nervous gesture Miss Marple had noticed the day before. Behind her, Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, was attempting to calm Mrs. Price Ridley with quotations from the Psalms, an endeavor that met with limited success. Inside the post office, the atmosphere was electric. Miss Felicity Blacklock, small, angular, and usually as composed as a well-starched collar, was clearly at the end of her tether. Her steel-rimmed spectacles flashed as she slammed stamps onto the counter with unnecessary violence. "Next!" she snapped, though the bell above the door had scarcely stopped tinkling. When Miss Marple finally reached the counter, she asked in her gentlest voice for 2 shillings worth of penny stamps and a postal order for the Belgian Relief Fund. Miss Blacklock counted the stamps with trembling fingers. "You must be terribly upset, Miss Blacklock," Miss Marple said sympathetically, "after the dreadful things Colonel Blakeney said to you last week, so public and so unjust." Miss Blacklock's lips thinned to a line. "I have never been so insulted in my life," she declared loudly enough for the entire queue to hear. "Accusing me, of tampering with His Majesty's mails. As though I would stoop to such a thing, though I will say," she dropped her voice to a piercing whisper that carried just as far, Some of those letters he received were enough to make your hair curl. Perfumed notepaper from a woman in London, dearest Lulu, if you please, and bills from a solicitor that would have made a bishop blush. Timothy Green, 2 places back, went scarlet and stared fixedly at the notice about national savings certificates. Miss Marple, accepting her change, murmured, "Letters can be very dangerous things, can't they? Especially when someone feels they have been mishandled." Miss Blacklock gave a short, bitter laugh. "He threatened to have me dismissed, Miss Marple. 32 years unblemished service, and he thought he could ruin me because his private affairs were not quite as private as he wished. Well, someone has saved me the trouble of defending my honor." The Q gasped in delighted unison. Miss Marple, pocketing her stamps, said mildly, "But murder is rather a drastic form of defense, don't you think?" Miss Blacklock realized she had gone too far. She busied herself with the date stamp, her cheeks flushed. "I spoke out of turn. Naturally, I am shocked at what happened. Next!" As Miss Marple turned to leave, Timothy Green caught her sleeve. "Miss Marple, may I walk with you a moment?" His voice was urgent, almost pleading. Outside, beneath the swaying sign of the Blue Boar, he burst out, "You don't believe I had anything to do with it, do you? I know Uncle Lucius was beastly to me. He called my paintings daubs and threatened to burn my canvases, but I'm not a murderer." Miss Marple regarded the young man kindly. He was trembling, his eyes magnified behind the thick lenses. "My dear boy," she said, "murderers very seldom look like murderers. That is what makes them so difficult to catch. But tell me, were you in the square yesterday morning?" Timothy swallowed. I arrived just as the crowd was gathering. I'd come to buy turpentine from Mr. Clement's shop. When I saw Uncle Lucius lying there, I felt quite sick. And then someone said it was a stabbing, and I thought of all the times he'd threatened to cut me off without a shilling." His voice cracked. Miss Marple patted his arm. "Fear is a very natural reaction, Timothy, but fear is not guilt. Now run along. I see Miss Hartnell waving to you. Something about the flower rota, I expect." Timothy fled gratefully. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned her steps toward the vicarage. On the way, she passed the now empty market square. The stalls had been dismantled, leaving only faint rectangular marks on the cobbles and a single forgotten cabbage rolling forlornly in the wind. She paused by the war memorial, her gaze lingering on the spot where Colonel Blakeney had fallen. A constable still stood guard, looking cold and bored. "Tell me, Constable," Miss Marple asked, "did anyone notice anything unusual drop near the body? A handkerchief, perhaps, or a glove?" The young man touched his helmet. "Nothing, miss. Only that paper bag of sweets he was clutching, still in his hand when the doctor came." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and continued on her way. At the vicarage, she found Mrs. Dane Calthrop in the garden, tying up sweet peas with raffia. The vicar's wife greeted her with relief. "Jane, thank heaven, I am quite distracted. The entire parish seems to think the murderer will strike again at evensong." Miss Marple accepted a garden chair and a cup of camp coffee. "People always fear what they do not understand," she said. "But understanding is merely a matter of noticing the right details. Tell me, did you happen to see Miss Blacklock yesterday morning?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop considered. "Yes, she was serving when I posted the parish magazine. She seemed perfectly ordinary then, though she did drop something when the scream went up. A knitting needle, I think, bright red. She was quite flustered looking for it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A knitting needle. How interesting." She rose, brushing a speck of earth from her skirt. "Thank you, my dear. You have been most helpful." As she walked back down the lane, the wind had dropped and the clouds were parting to reveal a watery sun. Somewhere a blackbird began to sing again, as though the village itself were trying to pretend that nothing had changed. But Miss Marple knew better. A red knitting needle, a bag of peppermint drops, and a queue full of villagers nursing grudges. Somewhere among those ordinary details lay the truth of a murder, and she intended to find it. Chapter 5. The Garden Fete Committee, the emergency meeting of the St. Mary Mead. Garden Fete Committee was held as all crises in the village were eventually held in the large parlor of the vicarage. Outside, a soft June rain pattered against the diamond-paned windows and turned the gravel path to the color of porridge. But inside the room glowed with lamplight and righteous determination. Murder might stalk the market square, but the annual fete, scheduled for the following Saturday on the lawn of Gossington Hall, must go on. The very thought that it might not was unthinkable, like suggesting that the church clock should stop because someone had died. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, tall, untidy, and radiating the calm certainty of one who has long ago handed all insoluble problems to a higher authority, sat at the head of the walnut table with an agenda written in violet ink. Around her were ranged the usual stalwarts. Miss Hartnell in rustling taffeta and an expression of perpetual outrage. Miss Weatherby, small, mouse-like, and anxious to please. Mrs. Price Ridley, still vibrating from the post office queue. Mrs. Bantry, magnificent in purple velvet despite the warmth of the room, and rather surprisingly Captain Roger Hale, who had been co-opted at the last moment because someone was needed to erect the coconut shy, and no one else possessed both muscles and a modicum of charm. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner by the fireplace, her lavender knitting rising and falling like gentle waves. She had been invited, as she always was, in case any little questions of precedent arose, which everyone understood to mean that she would listen to everything and say very little until the moment it mattered. Mrs. Dane Calthrop rapped the table with a spoon. "Ladies and Captain Hale, we are met under the shadow of tragedy, yet the fete is our chief means of raising funds for the restoration of the church tower. The bishop himself has expressed interest. We cannot, must not, let a little local unpleasantness interfere." Miss Hartnell gave a snort that threatened to dislodge her spectacles. A little local unpleasantness. A man stabbed to death not 20 yards from the cake stall. The coconut shy was to have been placed exactly where poor Colonel Blakeney fell. The taste of it! Captain Hale leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigarette with lazy grace. "Speaking of taste," he drawled, exhaling a perfect smoke ring, "I happened to overhear young Timothy Green quarreling rather heatedly with his uncle the afternoon before the murder. Something about money for degenerate modern art, I believe. Voices were raised. The colonel threatened to burn every canvas Timothy owned. Nasty scene." A ripple of delicious horror ran around the table. Mrs. Price Ridley clasped her bosom. "I always said that boy was unstable. All that painting and poetry never natural in a man." Miss Marple's needles clicked peacefully. "Young men are often passionate about their vocations," she murmured, "and uncles are frequently passionate about economy. It is a combination that has led to raised voices since biblical times." Mrs. Bantry, who had been waiting for precisely this opening, leaned forward like a ship under full sail. "What I want to know is why Evelyn Pritchard is not here. She was supposed to be in charge of the White Elephant stall, and now we hear she is taken to her bed with nervous prostration. Most convenient, if you ask me." Mrs. Dane Calthrop looked distressed. "My dear, the poor woman has just lost her husband in the most dreadful circumstances." "Lost him?" Mrs. Bantry said darkly. "Some might say she was trying to lose him for months." Miss Hartnell gave a meaningful cough. "There is talk, only talk, of course, that Captain Hale was assisting her in the losing." Captain Hale smiled, unperturbed. "Gossip is the spice of village life, ladies. I merely offered a shoulder to cry on. Several shoulders have been offered, I believe. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Shoulders can be very comforting, she said mildly, especially when one is carrying a burden of secrets. An awkward silence fell, broken only by the rain and the ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Dane Calthrop seized the agenda like a life belt. To practical matters. The coconut shy cannot, of course, be placed opposite the war memorial this year. It would be in the most deplorable taste. I propose we move it to the far lawn behind the rose arbor. Miss Weatherby raised a trembling hand. But the ground there is very uneven. Last year, Mr. Polk twisted his ankle rather badly. Then we shall have to level it, Mrs. Dane Calthrop said firmly. Captain Hale, could you and some of the younger men— Of course, Hale said, crushing out his cigarette. Happy to wield a spade in a good cause, though I must say the colonel would have had a fit at the idea of moving anything to suit sentiment. He always insisted the shy went in the same place, said tradition mattered more than taste. Mrs. Price Ridley bristled. Tradition? The man changed his will more often than his shirts. My husband's cousin at the solicitor's office says there have been 4 different versions in the last 2 years alone. Timothy was in, then out, then in again. Enough to drive anyone to desperation? Miss Marple's voice floated gently into the pause that followed. Wills are such fascinating documents, are they not? They reveal so much about character and about fear. The colonel, I think, lived in fear of being forgotten or laughed at. That is why he clung to routine. The same seat in church, the same walk to the post office, the same peppermint drops every Thursday. Mrs. Bantry stared. How on earth do you know about the peppermint drops? Because I observe, Miss Marple said simply. And because Mrs. Simpkins at the sweet stall told me yesterday that the colonel had been a regular customer for 15 years, always demanding the bag be twisted with the red stripe outward. A small vanity, but vanities can be revealing. Captain Hale laughed softly. The old boy did like his little rituals. I once saw him send an entire breakfast back because the toast was cut into squares instead of triangles. Evelyn Pritchard's absence hung over the meeting like a ghost at the feast. Eventually, Mrs. Dane Calthrop closed the discussion with prayer, and the committee dispersed into the rain with umbrellas blooming like black mushrooms. Miss Marple lingered to help stack the hymn books being used as agenda weights. Mrs. Dane Calthrop touched her arm. Jane, do you really believe poor Evelyn? I believe, Miss Marple said, that everyone in this village is hiding something. The question is whose secret was worth killing for and whose secret is still worth killing to protect. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. Miss Marple walked home along the dripping lanes, her mind turning over the afternoon like a careful housewife turning soil. Timothy's quarrel, Hale's studied nonchalance, the repeated emphasis on the colonel's rigid habits, the convenient absence of the widow. Each was a small pebble dropped into still water, and the ripples were beginning to overlap in interesting ways. At her gate she paused, looking back toward the church tower rising through the haze. Somewhere in the village a clock struck 6 and a blackbird began its evening song from the vicarage yew tree. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Garden fates and coconut shies, wills and peppermint drops. Apparently trivial things, yet murder, she reflected, was very often a trivial crime committed for trivial reasons by people who believed themselves above suspicion. She went indoors to find Cherry had left a boiled egg and fingers of toast for her supper, and a fresh pot of tea staying warm beneath a quilted cozy worked in violets. Miss Marple ate slowly, her thoughts circling the war memorial and the empty space where a weapon had vanished as completely as last year's snow. People see only what they expect to see, she murmured to the quiet room. and yesterday the entire village expected to see Colonel Blakeney buying sweets. No one thought to look at what he might have been given along with them. She finished her tea, rinsed the cup with her usual precision, and climbed the stairs to bed. Outside, the rain ceased, and a watery moon rose over St. Mary Mead, silvering the wet roofs in the silent market square where a man had died clutching a paper bag that might, after all, have held more than peppermints. Miss Marple drew her curtains, turned off the light, and lay in the familiar darkness listening to the small sounds of the village settling for the night. A dog barking in the distance, the creak of the bakery van making its early deliveries, the soft sigh of wind in the apple trees. Somewhere among those ordinary noises, she thought sleepily, was the sound of guilt trying very hard to walk softly. And tomorrow, if she listened carefully enough, she might hear it stumble. Chapter 6. The missing knitting needle night had folded itself gently over St. Mary Mead, the kind of velvet darkness that only comes in June when the sky is deep indigo and the air smells of cooling grass and distant wood smoke. In Miss Marple's small drawing room, the fire had sunk to a handful of ruby coals, and the only light came from the shaded lamp beside her chair. The lavender bed jacket had grown another 6 rows under her fingers, but her eyes were not on the stitches. She was listening to the village the way a sailor listens to the sea. Every creak of a gate, every muffled cough from a cottage bedroom, every owl hooting from the spinney behind the vicarage carried its own small message. Cherry, her maid, had gone up an hour ago, leaving a hot water bottle in the bed and a glass of milk on the tray. Miss Marple had thanked her absently, her mind already elsewhere. Now she laid the knitting aside, rose with the quiet decision of someone who has reached the end of waiting, and fetched her writing case from the bureau. On a fresh sheet of her pale blue notepaper, she began to set down, in her neat slanting hand, every detail she could remember of the previous morning in the market square. She wrote first of the scream, then of the circle of faces frozen in shock around the war memorial. She listed them as they had appeared to her practiced eye. Mrs. Pritchard with her gloved hand pressed to her mouth, Captain Hale half a step behind her, one arm half raised as though he had meant to catch her if she fell. Timothy Green, white and swaying, Miss Blacklock clutching her bundle of letters. Mrs. Dane Calthrop already forming the words of a prayer. She noted the exact position of the colonel's body, the thin crimson line at his throat, the paper bag still clenched in his gloved fingers. And then, very carefully, she wrote the single sentence that had been circling her mind all day like a moth around a candle. No one searched the sweet bag. She underlined the words twice, then sat back, listening to the silence. At length she rang the little brass bell that stood on the table. Cherry appeared almost at once, hair in curlers and a wool dressing gown clutched about her. "You'll catch your death sitting here in the cold, ma'am," she began, then saw her mistress's face and stopped. "Cherry," Miss Marple said quietly, "when you were in the crowd yesterday, did you happen to notice anyone carrying anything that might have been sharp? A brooch, perhaps, or a hat pin?" Cherry frowned, thinking hard. "Well, there was Mrs. Butt from the butcher's shop with her big steel skewer. She always carries it to test melons. And Miss Hartnell had her umbrella, but the ferrule was rubber-tipped. Oh, and Miss Blacklock, she dropped something bright red when the screaming started. A knitting needle, I think, size 8, maybe 9. She scrabbled about for it on the cobbles, but couldn't find it. Said it must have rolled away in the commotion." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Red, you say? And she was distressed?" "Ever so. Kept saying it was her favorite needle, aluminium, light as a feather and perfect for 4-ply. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, Cherry. That is most helpful. Now go back to bed, there's a good girl. I shan't need anything more tonight." When the maid had gone, Miss Marple returned to her list. Beside Miss Blacklock's name, she wrote, "Knitting needle, Red, missing. Then she drew a small, precise arrow to the word sweet bag. She sat for a long time, the fire settling into gray ash, turning the possibilities over like pieces on a chessboard. A thin, sharp instrument that could be carried openly in a woman's hand and yet vanish within seconds. A paper bag twisted in a particular way. A crowd so tightly packed that no one noticed a swift, downward thrust. And a postmistress with a grievance sharp enough to cut deeper than any needle. At length she rose, banked the fire, and went upstairs. Sleep came slowly, but when it came, it was sound, the sleep of one whose mind has finally found the shape of the puzzle. Morning brought pale sunlight and a breeze that sent the curtains dancing. Miss Marple was in her garden by 8, deadheading roses and exchanging pleasantries over the fence with old Mr. Gadstone, who was complaining about sparrows. She listened with half an ear while her thoughts circled the post office. At 9:30, she put on her second-best hat, the one with the velvet pansies, and set out. The post office was busy again, though the queue was shorter and the mood less feverish. Miss Blacklock served with mechanical efficiency, her mouth set in a thin line. When Miss Marple reached the counter, she asked for a book of sixpenny stamps and then, very gently, "I hear you lost something precious in the confusion yesterday, Miss Blacklock." "A red knitting needle?" Miss Blacklock's hand jerked. The date stamp came down with a thud that nearly tore the paper. "Who told you that?" she demanded, then caught herself and lowered her voice. "Yes, my best needle, aluminium. I've hunted high and low." "Such a pity," Miss Marple sympathized. "Though I dare say the police searched thoroughly. They are so methodical." Miss Blacklock gave a short, humorless laugh. "They turned out every handbag and basket, but they never thought to look under the stalls. It will be trampled flat by now, I expect." Miss Marple bought a postal order she did not need and left, pausing on the step to adjust her glove. Across the square, she could see Constable Polk still on duty by the memorial, looking damp and martyred. She crossed to him. "Good morning, Constable. Such a trying time for you all. Tell me, when the excitement occurred, did anyone pick anything up from the ground near the Colonel? A handkerchief, perhaps, or something small?" Polk scratched his head. "Not as I saw, miss. Mind you, there was such a to-do. People milling about like sheep." Miss Marple thanked him and walked on, her mind busy. A knitting needle could be dropped, kicked, swept aside in the confusion. Or it could be concealed inside something else entirely, something no one would think to examine twice. She spent the rest of the morning on small errands. A pound of butter from the dairy, a reel of white cotton from the draper's, a bunch of mint from old Mrs. Green who grew it in her back garden. At each stop, she listened. The village was settling into the comfortable conviction that the murder had been the work of a passing tramp, some desperate soul who had melted away into the countryside. Only Miss Marple, and perhaps one other person, knew how absurd that theory was. Chapter 7. A Second Death. The days following the Market Square murder slipped by with the deceptive calm that only English villages can achieve after violence. The ropes came down, the stalls returned, and the war memorial was scrubbed until the stone gleamed again, as though blood had never stained the cobbles. Colonel Blakeney's funeral took place on a blustery afternoon. The church was crowded with the respectfully curious and the genuinely bereaved in roughly equal measure. Evelyn Pritchard, veiled in black crape, leaned heavily on Captain Hale's arm, while Timothy Green stood alone at the back, twisting a paint-stained handkerchief until it tore. Miss Blacklock, rigid in navy serge, read the lesson in a voice that cracked only once. Afterwards, in the churchyard, the wind whipped at coats and hats while the vicar murmured the final prayers. Miss Marple stood a little apart, sheltered by the yew tree, watching faces the way a gardener watches for greenfly. She noticed how Captain Hale's hand lingered at Evelyn's waist, how Timothy avoided his cousin's eye, how Miss Blacklock kept glancing toward the lich gate as though expecting someone who never arrived. Tea was served at Blakeney House, seed cake and sherry in the drawing room that still smelled faintly of the Colonel's cigars. Miss Marple accepted a cup but declined the cake. She had eaten little since the murder, sustaining herself on tea and observation. Conversation was subdued at first, then grew louder as sherry loosened tongues. Someone mentioned the inquest at which the verdict had been murder by person or persons unknown, and the room buzzed like a disturbed hive. Miss Marple slipped away early, pleading a slight headache. On the way home, she paused at the post office, which wore its closed notice like a bandage. Through the glass, she could see Miss Blacklock moving about inside, sorting the evening mail with quick, angry movements. Their eyes met for a moment. The postmistress gave a curt nod and pulled the blind. That night, Miss Marple sat late again, her notebook open on the table beside a cooling pot of cocoa. She added a new column headed Motive and wrote 4 names: Evelyn Pritchard, Freedom and Inheritance Captain Hale, Love and Perhaps Money. Timothy Green, Inheritance and Years of Humiliation. Felicity Blacklock, Fear of Disgrace and Dismissal. Beside the last name, she drew a small red question mark. Tuesday brought rain, soft and steady, turning the lanes to mud and the sky to pearl. Miss Marple spent the morning writing letters and the afternoon dozing by the fire, a rare indulgence that left her refreshed and clear-headed. At 4 o'clock she put on her mackintosh and oldest shoes and walked to the vicarage to return a book of sermons Mrs. Dane Calthrop had lent her. The vicarage gate stood ajar. Inside, the garden was deserted, sweet peas drooping under the weight of water. Miss Marple let herself in by the side door and shook rain from her umbrella. She was crossing the hall toward the study when she heard voices from the kitchen. Mrs. Dane Calthrop and another woman speaking in low, urgent tones. "Simply must tell someone, poor soul," the vicar's wife was saying. "She came to me yesterday quite distracted. Said she had done something terribly wrong, but not what the Colonel accused her of. She was going to the police this afternoon." The second voice, Miss Blacklock's, thin and trembling, answered, "I can't bear it any longer. If they find out about the letters, oh, I never meant harm, only a little harmless curiosity. But he would have ruined me." Miss Marple stepped quietly back into the shadow of the grandfather clock. After a moment, the kitchen door opened and Miss Blacklock emerged, buttoning her raincoat, her face white and set. She did not see the small figure by the stairs. She hurried out into the rain, letting the door bang behind her. Mrs. Dane Calthrop appeared moments later, wringing her hands. "Jane, I didn't hear you come in. Oh, my dear, I am so worried. Felicity Blacklock has just left. She is in great distress. I fear she knows something about the murder." Miss Marple laid a calming hand on her friend's arm. "Then we must hope she reaches Inspector Craddock safely," she said, though her eyes were grave. She left the vicarage a few minutes later and walked slowly toward the high street. The rain had eased to a drizzle. Gutters ran like little rivers, carrying petals and twigs toward the drain. The post office light was still on. Through the window, Miss Marple saw Miss Blacklock at the counter, her back to the door, sorting parcels with frantic haste. Miss Marple hesitated, then turned away. Some instinct warned her that intervention now might do more harm than good. She continued home, changed into dry stockings, and sat down to wait. The call came at 6:20. Cherry answered the telephone in the hall and came running, eyes wide. "It's Dr. Haydock, ma'am. Urgent. He says Miss Blacklock has been found in the post office, dead." Miss Marple reached for her coat without a word. The post office was lit like a stage. 2 constables stood outside. Inside, Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body. Miss Blacklock lay on her side among scattered parcels and string, one arm flung out as though she had tried to ward off the blow. A single dark stain spread across the bodice of her navy dress just below the collarbone. Her eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. Inspector Craddock arrived minutes later, rain dripping from his hat. He took one look and swore softly under his breath. "Same method," Haydock said grimly. "Narrow blade straight to the carotid. Death almost instantaneous. No sign of a struggle. She must have known her killer." Craddock's gaze swept the room, lingering on the shelves of brown paper, the balls of twine, the neat stacks of forms. Weapon? Gone. Just like the last time. Miss Marple stood quietly in the doorway, umbrella still dripping onto the mat. Craddock saw her and gave a curt nod that was half welcome, half resignation. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here." "I was passing," she said mildly, though both knew it was untrue. "May I?" Craddock stepped aside. Miss Marple moved forward with the careful dignity of age, her eyes taking in every detail. The overturned stool, the half-tied parcel beneath Miss Blacklock's hand, the faint scent of peppermint that hung incongruously in the air. She bent slowly, because her knees were not what they had once been, and looked into the waste paper basket beside the counter. Inside lay a crumpled paper bag, red and white stripes twisted neatly with the red stripe outward. It was empty save for a tiny dark stain in one corner and the ghost of a sweet smell. Miss Marple straightened, her face very pale but perfectly composed. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we have been looking in the wrong direction. The same hand did not strike twice. The first murder created a murderer. The second murder was committed to silence a witness." Craddock stared at the paper bag as though it might bite him. "You're saying Miss Blacklock killed the colonel?" "I am saying," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that someone very much wishes us to think so. And they have gone to considerable trouble to arrange it." She looked once more at the body of the little postmistress lying so still among the everyday tools of her trade and felt a great sadness settle over her heart like the rain outside. "Poor soul," she murmured. "She opened one letter too many, or perhaps not enough." Outside, the church clock struck 7. The rain had stopped, and a watery moon silvered the puddles in the square. Somewhere a dog barked once, then thought better of it. St. Mary Mead, having buried one victim, now prepared to bury another, and the gentle rhythm of village life went on. Tea cooling in pots, fires being banked for the night, secrets nesting deeper in frightened hearts. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet streets, her umbrella furled, raindrops cool on her face. She did not look back at the lighted post office or at the small crowd beginning to gather. She was thinking of peppermint drops and red knitting needles, of twisted paper and twisted motives, and of how very easy it is in a place where everyone knows everyone else, to mistake the face of a friend for the face of a killer. At her gate she paused, drawing a long breath of the damp, sweet air. Tomorrow there would be another funeral, more sherry and seed cake, more carefully averted eyes. But tonight there was only the soft darkness and the knowledge that somewhere very close, a murderer was learning that one death is seldom enough. She went indoors, hung her coat with care, and sat down at her little table. From the drawer she took her notebook and turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, in her clear, precise hand, "Second murder changes everything." Then she drew 2 columns. In the first she wrote, "Who feared Miss Blacklock would talk." In the second, "Who could enter the post office after hours without causing alarm?" She stared at the empty columns for a long time. Then very deliberately she wrote a single name beneath them both. After that she closed the book, tied the ribbon, and went to bed. But she did not sleep. She lay in the quiet darkness, listening to the village breathe and waiting for morning. Chapter 8. The Truth in the Twisted Paper. The drawing room at Blakeney House had never felt so crowded nor so cold. Rain lashed the tall windows like thrown gravel, and the fire that had been laid with such care did little more than hiss and sulk. Every lamp was lit, throwing circles of yellow light onto the faces gathered in a stiff half-circle. Evelyn Pritchard in unrelieved black, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white. Captain Roger Hale, outwardly at ease in the wing chair, but with a pulse beating hard at his temple. Timothy Green perched on the edge of a gilt fauteuil as though ready to bolt. Mrs. Dane Calthrop upright and sorrowful, Mrs. Bantry magnificent in plum-colored velvet and barely suppressed excitement. Inspector Craddock by the door with 2 constables, and Miss Marple, small and gray and terrible in her quiet certainty, standing beside the marble mantelpiece with the crumpled peppermint bag held lightly between thumb and forefinger. No one spoke. Outside, the storm growled and retreated, growled again. Miss Marple broke the silence as gently as one might break a teacup. 2 murders in 1 week, she said, committed by 2 different hands, yet linked by the same small object. She lifted the red and white paper bag so that the lamplight caught the faint dark stain at one corner. A bag of bullseye peppermint drops, the Colonel's favorite sweet. Mrs. Simpkins at the market stall always twisted the top in a special way, with the red stripe outward, because that was how Colonel Blakeney liked it. A harmless vanity, one might think. But vanities can be fatal when they are copied by someone who believes no one will notice. She turned the bag slowly so they could all see the twist. On the morning of the murder, Miss Felicity Blacklock bought a small packet of peppermints from Mrs. Simpkins. Not for herself, she disliked peppermint, but because she intended to meet Colonel Blakeney in the crowd. Inside the innocent paper bag she carried her red aluminium knitting needle. It was light, sharp, no more than 6 inches long and perfectly invisible once the bag was closed. When the moment came, amid the press of shoppers with everyone looking toward the strawberry stall, she struck once, downward, severing the carotid artery. The Colonel staggered, fell, and in the confusion she let the bag slip from her hand into the litter bin beside the memorial, knowing his own gloved fingers would seem to have held it as he died. Evelyn Pritchard made a small choked sound. Captain Hale lit a cigarette with fingers that barely trembled. Miss Blacklock believed she had committed the perfect crime, Miss Marple continued. The weapon had vanished, the crowd provided 100 alibis, and her grievance was public knowledge. But she made one tiny mistake. In her agitation, she twisted the bag exactly as the Colonel himself would have done, red stripe outward. A detail so small that only someone who had noticed the Colonel's fussiness would ever remark it. I remarked it. She laid the first bag on the mantelpiece and produced a second, even more crumpled, taken from the post office wastebasket. 4 days later, Miss Blacklock was herself murdered in exactly the same way. The same narrow wound, the same vanished weapon, and again a peppermint bag, twisted with the red stripe outward, left behind like a signature. Most of us assumed the same hand had struck twice. That was what the killer intended. Yet the differences are instructive. The first murder required daring and precise timing in broad daylight. The second was quieter, almost domestic, committed behind a locked door by someone Miss Blacklock trusted enough to turn her back on. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved gently around the room and settled on Captain Hale. You, Captain Hale, discovered that Miss Blacklock had intercepted certain letters proving that you were already married when you persuaded Mrs. Pritchard to believe she could soon be free to marry you. Those letters would have ruined everything. Your prospects with a wealthy widow, your reputation, perhaps even your liberty for bigamy. When Miss Blacklock confessed to Mrs. Dane Calthrop that she intended to go to the police, you knew you had only hours. Hale laughed, a short, ugly sound. Charming fairy tale, Miss Marple. You have no proof. I have this. She opened the second bag and tipped something onto her palm. A slender red knitting needle, its tip darkened with dried blood. After killing Miss Blacklock, you retrieved the original weapon from wherever she had hidden it, probably in the post office safe, used it again, and planted the second peppermint bag to suggest the murders were the work of a single maniac. But you were agitated. You twisted the bag exactly as Miss Blacklock had done the first time, red stripe outward. The Colonel's own habit, copied unconsciously by his killer and then copied again by his killer's killer. 3 murders planned, 2 committed, all betrayed by a twist of cheap paper. The room was utterly still. Rain hammered the windows like impatient fists. Hale crushed out his cigarette and stood. Very clever, he said softly. But a court won't hang a man on knitting, needles and sweet bags. They will, Inspector Craddock said, stepping forward. When the needle bears your fingerprints, which it does on the shaft where you grasped it to wipe the handle clean, and when Mrs. Simpkins identifies you as the person who bought a second packet of bullseyes on Tuesday afternoon, saying they were for an invalid friend, they will also listen when the post office safe yields the letters you tried to burn, only scorched at the edges, quite legible. And finally, Captain Hale, they will hear Mrs. Pritchard confirm that you spent Tuesday evening with her until 10 o'clock, giving you just enough time to walk Miss Blacklock home, be invited in for a cup of tea and silence her forever. Evelyn Pritchard rose like a sleepwalker. Roger? Her voice was barely a breath. Tell them it isn't true. Hale looked at her for a long moment, something almost like pity in his eyes. Then the mask dropped. I'm sorry, Evie, he said. He was a brute and you deserved better, but I couldn't let that wretched woman ruin us both. He made a sudden lunge toward the French windows, but Craddock was ready. The constables moved with practiced speed, handcuffs clicked. Hale was borne backwards, struggling for only a moment before the fight went out of him. Mrs. Dane Calthrop began to cry quietly into her handkerchief. Timothy Green sat as though turned to stone. Mrs. Bantry gave a triumphant sniff that threatened to become a cheer. Miss Marple stood very still, the 2 paper bags side by side on the mantelpiece like exhibits in a museum of human folly. It is always the little things, she said almost to herself. A twist of paper, a drop of blood, a moment of inattention. Murder is such a crude response to life's complications, one might almost say, untidy. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you. She gave him the gentlest of smiles. A cup of tea when this is all over will be quite sufficient, Inspector. And perhaps a slice of Mrs. Bantry's excellent seed cake. Outside the storm had passed. A watery moon sailed between the clouds, silvering the wet gravel and the silent garden. Somewhere a nightingale began to sing, as though the world, having rid itself of one more darkness, could afford to be beautiful again. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The storm had moved on as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the night rinsed and shining. Water dripped from the eaves of Blakeney House in steady silver ticks, and every leaf in the garden gleamed as though it had been newly created. Inside the drawing room, the air still crackled with the aftermath of revelation. The smell of Hale's crushed cigarette mingled with the scent of wet lilac drifting through the open French windows. Captain Roger Hale stood between the 2 constables, the lamplight harsh on his face. The easy charm had peeled away like cheap varnish, revealing something raw and cornered. His wrists were already ringed with steel, yet he held himself very straight, the old naval discipline asserting itself one last time. Evelyn Pritchard had not moved from the sofa. She sat as though someone had unplugged her from the world, hands limp in her lap, eyes fixed on Hale with a kind of wounded wonder, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time and could not quite believe the picture. You killed Felicity? She whispered. For me? Hale's mouth twisted, half sneer, half plea. Not for you, Evie. For us. She was going to destroy everything. The letters, she had the marriage lines, the registry certificate, all of it. One word to the police and I'd have been finished, and you'd have been left with nothing. The Colonel's money all tied up in trusts, the house mortgaged to the hilt. We were so close. Evelyn's voice shook. I never asked you to kill anyone. Never. No, he said bitterly. You only looked at me with those eyes and said how unbearable it was to be married to a bully who watched every penny and every minute. You only let me hold you in the rose garden and promise that soon it would be over. What was I supposed to think? Inspector Craddock shifted his weight, impatient. That's enough, Hale. You'll have plenty of time for speeches at the trial. But Hale was not finished. He turned to the room at large, the old actor's instinct rising above the ruin. You all despised him, he said, sweeping them with a contemptuous glance. Don't pretend you didn't. The Colonel, with his barking voice and his petty cruelties, he drove that poor little postmistress half mad with his accusations. She told me herself, the night I walked her home, that she sometimes dreamed of putting an end to him. All I did was turn her dream into reality and then tidy up the only loose thread. Miss Marple's voice cut across the room, soft as thistledown and twice as penetrating. You did not tidy, Captain Hale. You tangled. Murder never tidies anything. It only creates more knots for someone else to unravel. Hale gave a short, humorless laugh. And you, Miss Marple, you with your knitting and your cups of tea, you've appointed yourself the village unraveler, have you? Tell me, how does it feel to send a man to the gallows because of a twisted sweetbag? Miss Marple regarded him steadily. I feel no triumph, Captain, only sorrow that a man who once navigated oceans by the stars should have lost his way so completely in a village lane. Timothy Green found his voice at last, thin and shaking. You might have killed me next. Uncle Lucius was always threatening to change his will again. If Miss Blacklock had lived to talk, Hale shrugged. You were never in danger, boy. You paint pretty pictures and keep out of the way. Harmless. Timothy flushed scarlet, whether from relief or humiliation no one could tell. Mrs. Dane Calthrop rose, her tall figure trembling with righteous anger. You used Felicity's fear and desperation as a shield for your own greed. She was a lonely woman who made one foolish mistake, and you turned it into her death warrant. Hale met her gaze without flinching. Better one frightened spinster than both of us in the dock. Evelyn stood up suddenly as though a string inside her had snapped. She walked the few steps to where Hale stood and looked at him for a long moment. Then, quite deliberately, she slapped him across the face with all the strength grief could lend her. The sound cracked like a pistol shot. That, she said, her voice steady for the first time that evening, is for Felicity Blacklock, who never hurt anyone in her life until you made her a murderer in the eyes of the world. And this... She drew back her hand again but let it fall. This is for me, because I was vain enough to believe you loved me more than you loved yourself. Hale's cheek bore a livid mark, but he did not move. Something in his eyes flickered and went out. Inspector Craddock took Hale's arm. Time to go. As the constables led him toward the door, Hale paused beside Miss Marple. You're a dangerous old woman, he said quietly. No, she replied, only observant. There is a difference. The door closed behind them. The sound of the police car starting up was muffled by the wet gravel, then faded into the night. For a moment no one spoke. Rainwater dripped from the gutters. Somewhere a night bird called once and was still. Evelyn sank back onto the sofa and began to cry, not theatrically, but with the slow, hopeless tears of someone whose pretty dream has been torn down to the foundations. Mrs. Bantry, never one for inaction, poured a stiff brandy and pressed it into her hand. Mrs. Dane Calthrop moved to the window and stood looking out at the moonlit garden. 2 funerals in a fortnight, she said softly. Poor St. Mary Mead will be quite worn out with black gloves. Timothy Green cleared his throat. I think I'll go home. There's a canvas I was working on. I might finish it now. He managed a watery smile. Uncle Lucius can't threaten to burn it anymore. He slipped away, closing the door with exaggerated care, as though loud noises might shatter what remained of the evening. Miss Marple gathered her handbag and the 2 fateful peppermint bags, now wrapped carefully in tissue. Inspector Craddock will want these, she said, and I believe I have imposed quite long enough on Mrs. Pritchard's hospitality. Evelyn looked up, eyes swollen. You knew almost from the beginning, didn't you? I suspected, Miss Marple corrected gently. Suspicion is a heavy burden. Certainty is heavier still, but at least it can be laid down. She moved toward the door, then paused. My dear, there is a difference between wishing someone gone and seeing them murdered in front of the strawberry stall. You will sleep more peacefully now that justice has been done, even though the manner of it was cruel. Mrs. Bantry followed her into the hall, closing the drawing-room door on Evelyn's quiet sobbing. Jane, she said in an awed whisper, I have known you for 50 years and you still terrify me sometimes. Miss Marple smiled, a small, tired smile. Only the guilty need be terrified, Dolly. The rest of us may simply go home and have a nice cup of cocoa. Outside, the air was cool and sweet after the storm. The moon rode high, turning the wet gravel to mother of pearl. Miss Marple walked slowly down the drive, her shoes making soft crunching sounds. At the gate, she paused and looked back at the house. Dark now except for one lamp burning in an upper window. Poor child, she murmured. She mistook charm for love and nearly paid for it with her soul. Then she turned toward home, where Cherry would have the kettle on and the hot water bottle warming, and where the lavender bed jacket waited for its final rouse. Behind her, Blakeney House settled into silence, its ghosts temporarily laid, though not, Miss Marple reflected, forever. In St. Mary Mead, as in all villages, some doors close only to open again on different shadows. But for tonight the square was quiet. The war memorial stood clean under the moon, and an old lady walked home beneath the stars, knowing that, for a little while at least, the village could sleep without fear. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Reflection. A week later, the sun rose over St. Mary Mead as though nothing more dreadful had ever happened than a dropped stitch. The village had buried Felicity Blacklock beside Colonel Blakeney in the churchyard, 2 fresh mounds side by side under the yew tree, already bright with early roses from sympathetic gardens. The market square bustled again. The war memorial had been given an extra polish, and the litter bin where a peppermint bag had once hidden death now held only a few toffee wrappers and a bus ticket. At 10:30, Miss Marple sat on the vicarage lawn beneath the cedar, a low table before her set with the best vicarage china. Eggshell cups, a Crown Derby plate of scones still warm from the oven, strawberry jam glowing like rubies, and a silver pot from which fragrant lapsang souchong curled in delicate spirals. Mrs. Dane Calthrop poured. The vicar himself had been banished to his study on pain of being made to discuss flower rotas. The lawn sloped gently to the ha-ha, and beyond it the meadows lay gold and green under the July sky. A blackbird sang from the cedar's topmost branch. Somewhere a mower hummed. Peace, of the particular English kind that feels earned rather than accidental, had returned. Mrs. Dane Calthrop handed Miss Marple a scone. I still cannot quite believe it is over, she said. 2 funerals, 1 trial looming, and poor Evelyn packing to leave for Devon. Blakeney House already has a board outside, for sale. Miss Marple spread jam with care. Villages recover quickly, my dear, they have to, otherwise the pain would be unbearable. Mrs. Dane Calthrop buttered her own scone thoughtfully. Tell me, Jane, I have waited patiently all week. How did you truly know about the peppermint bag? Miss Marple smiled over the rim of her cup. I have spent a lifetime watching people cling to small habits the way sailors cling to ropes in a storm. Colonel Blakeney's fuss about the red stripe was exactly the sort of detail a murderer might notice and copy, or copy again in Captain Hale's case. When I saw the second bag twisted in precisely the same way, I knew we were dealing not with one killer repeating himself, but with a second killer imitating the first. She took a delicate bite of scone. And then there was the needle itself. Miss Blacklock's red aluminium needle vanished in the market square and reappeared, bloodied, in the post office. Only someone who had access to her private hiding place could have retrieved it. Captain Hale walked her home the night she died. He had all the time in the world. Mrs. Dane Calthrop shook her head wonderingly. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, Miss Marple said. Once one accepts that human beings are almost always betrayed by vanity or fear, usually both. Captain Hale was vain enough to believe he could commit the perfect crime, and fearful enough to kill again when his first attempt began to unravel. Poor Miss Blacklock was merely the thread he tried to cut. A silence fell, comfortable and sunlit. From the meadow came the faint sound of children playing cricket. The crack of bat on ball drifted across the garden like birdsong. Timothy Green sold his first painting yesterday, Mrs. Dane Calthrop said suddenly. To an American lady staying at the Royal Spa Hotel. A view of the church from the duck pond. Quite charming, really. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I am glad. He will paint better now that no one threatens to burn his canvases. And Evelyn? Devon will be kind to her. Sea air, a small cottage, perhaps a cat. She was never wicked, only weak, and weakness can be mended where wickedness cannot. Mrs. Dane Calthrop refilled their cups. You are a remarkable woman, Jane Marple. Miss Marple gave a small, deprecating wave. I am merely an old maid who knits and notices things. The noticing is the important part. They sat a little longer, watching clouds drift across the sky like slow, contented sheep. The blackbird finished its song and flew off toward the orchard. The scones disappeared, the jam pot emptied, and the teapot was finally allowed to rest. At length, Miss Marple gathered her handbag and the finished lavender bed jacket, destined, after all, for the autumn jumble. Thank you, my dear, a perfect morning tea. Mrs. Dane Calthrop walked her to the gate. Will there be another murder, do you think? Miss Marple considered the quiet lane, the roses nodding over cottage walls. The postman cycling past with a cheerful whistle. Not for a little while, she said serenely. St. Mary Mead has had its excitement. People will be on their best behavior for months, and when the next small passion begins to simmer, there will be time enough to notice. She lifted her face to the sun, eyes half closed like a cat in a warm window. After all, one cannot knit all the time. Mrs. Dane Calthrop laughed softly and watched her friend walk away down the lane, small, straight-backed, unhurried. The lavender wool over her arm catching the light like a promise of ordinary, peaceful days to come. Behind her the cedar rustled. The blackbird returned to its branch and the village settled back into its familiar rhythm. Tea, gossip, roses, and the quiet certainty that, for now at least, evil had been noted, named, and neatly put away.